Today's video is not made for you. Today's video is not even made for the audience. I am making this for myself, for my children, and for history. Because one day history will ask, which side of this story were you standing on? Where were you when these events were unfolding? Where did you place yourself when this convoy of ships pushed across the sea, the Global Sumud Flotilla, bound for Gaza with aid and people trying to help? These were not warships. They were not carrying rockets or guns. They carried medicine, food, solar panels, ventilators, baby formula. Lifelines for ordinary people trapped behind a blockade. They were a human answer to a human emergency. The convoy was a vast and deliberate statement. Dozens of vessels, dozens of nations represented. Volunteers and parliamentarians, medical teams and activists sailing together toward Gaza to try to deliver relief. Organizers said the flotilla included ships from more than 40 countries and numbered around 40-odd vessels. The stated mission was to break a maritime blockade long in place, to create a corridor for humanitarian supplies, and to make visible the urgency of a crisis that many around the world felt was being ignored. News outlets reported that Israeli forces intercepted and boarded the majority of these ships over the course of several days, detaining hundreds and directing seized vessels to Israeli ports. The final ships were intercepted roughly within a little over 40 nautical miles of Gaza. When I think about this, I picture my children. That is not a rhetorical flourish. I picture my children living in a place where the day begins and ends with the taste of hunger, where half of the population is under 18, and where a child's life is, in all too many ways, precarious. Gaza today is home to over 2 million people, and a very large share of them are children. Imagine putting your child into such a place and watching the news. Imagine the raw, personal ache of it. The numbers become faces. The policy debate becomes a question you cannot avoid because it speaks to your own responsibility and choices. That is why this voyage mattered, because it was constructed as an answer to those faces. The flotilla's cargo was not trivial. Volunteers loaded the ships with tons of wheat, tens of thousands of baby formula packages, solar panels intended to power hundreds of ventilators, medications, and basic nutrition. One easily graspable metric, a single shipload of wheat or several tens of tons of food, can mean the difference between life and death for entire communities living on the edge of starvation. The organizers said that one of the shipments alone would have provided basic sustenance to tens of thousands for a significant period. They were not bringing weapons. They were bringing the things families need to eat and to keep sick children alive. From the moment the convoy left European ports in late August and September, it was followed by international attention, and by the predictable tension that comes when civilian-led missions confront a long-standing maritime security posture. The Israeli Navy began warning vessels to turn back. Several vessels reported being shadowed by warships and watched by military aircraft. In the days that followed, boarding operations took place at sea. Helicopters lowered soldiers to decks, and vessels were seized and escorted to Israeli ports. Reports indicated that more than 40 boats were intercepted and that hundreds of participants were detained and processed for deportation. Some prominent participants, parliamentarians, celebrities, and civil society leaders, were among those taken into custody. We must pause and ask what exactly the law permits at sea. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea sets out clear jurisdictional lines. Coastal states have sovereignty over their territorial sea, out to 12 nautical miles, and they enjoy certain rights in the contiguous zone up to 24 nautical miles. For resource exploitation, exclusive economic zones extend to 200 nautical miles. But these legal divisions depend on the stated purpose of the activities at sea. A convoy that is carrying humanitarian supplies and intends to approach a blockaded coast is not extracting resources, it is attempting to ship aid. The legal debate intensifies when one state claims a lawful blockade under the rules of armed conflict, and another party challenges the proportionality and necessity of that blockade. This is not an abstract debate. It has consequences on the people living behind those blockaded shores. The flotilla organizers were, by many accounts, aware of the risks. They expected pushback. They expected diplomatic pressure, surveillance, even the possibility of violent interdiction. But that expectation did not stop them. For many of those aboard, the urgency of feeding families, of delivering medical supplies outweighed the legal and tactical risks. For them, it was a moral imperative. History, in many instances, is moved forward by people who choose action over calculation. Think of stories we recognize. People who ran toward danger to rescue others. The organizers framed this as exactly that kind of moral action, not as a show of force, but as a public, non-violent attempt to place life-saving aid where it was needed. When the naval interdictions took place, the immediate result was the seizing of ships and the detention of passengers. Reports indicate dozens of vessels were seized. The exact number varied across sources as events unfolded, but the scale was unprecedented in recent years. One ship that gained particular attention reportedly managed to reach Gaza's waters and to offload supplies before being diverted or stopped. That rare success was quickly highlighted by activists and by families in Gaza who received aid. Simultaneously, the responses from the state enforcing the blockade were categorical. Authorities described the flotilla as a provocation, claimed it violated the blockade's legality, and said the state would ensure security both at sea and at its own ports. That enforcement created a cascade of diplomatic and legal reactions, from protests in multiple cities to urgent questions about the legality of intercepting humanitarian aid on the high seas. History has precedent. In 2010, the Mavi Marmara incident ended with several deaths after a violent boarding by forces enforcing the blockade. That event led to international court cases, compensation claims, and a long legacy of mistrust. This flotilla, sometimes called the Global Sumud Flotilla, intentionally invoked that memory. Organizers knew the past and still chose to proceed. The international legal fallout after prior flotillas involved court actions and compensation rulings. If this year's seizures lead to litigation, the scale could be larger than before, simply because more states and more individuals are involved. Insurance underwriters, the companies that insure ships and cargo, will also be drawn into the ensuing litigation. A reminder that even these humanitarian efforts are embedded in global legal and commercial networks. One of the most painful elements to consider is the human toll on children. Data reported in recent coverage, and by humanitarian organizations, indicates severe malnutrition in parts of Gaza. When agencies say that many people are surviving on caloric intakes far below internationally recognized minimums, that is not an abstraction. It is a description of children who are smaller and more vulnerable than they should be, families rationing the last of their food, and hospitals struggling to keep basic pediatrics functioning. You do not have to accept a political stance to recognize that failing to get food and medicine to children is a moral crisis. The flotilla's cargo, baby formula, wheat, medical supplies, spoke directly to that crisis. The ships were carrying the urgent necessities that could alleviate immediate suffering in clinics and homes. The question then is what the international community and individuals choose to do when confronted with that suffering. Will we protest? Will we organize? Will we try to push through channels that reach those in need, or will we let the technicalities of law and the habits of geopolitics drown out personal responsibility? There is also a geopolitical and symbolic dimension to where the ships were ordered to be redirected. Several vessels were diverted to an Israeli port, Ashdod, rather than being allowed to approach or enter Gazan waters. That diversion carries consequences. If aid is offloaded at an external port and then routed through state-controlled channels, the distributing authority is the state, not the independent civilian groups that brought the aid. For a state intent on maintaining the strictest controls over access, diverting the flotilla weakens the picture of a direct civilian maritime corridor into Gaza and preserves the blockade's practical control. For the organizers and the people of Gaza, that diversion changes the narrative from a civilian rescue to a state-controlled transfer, and many argue that transfers, mediated by the enforcing power, do not have the same immediacy or guarantee of distribution to those most in need.